Thanks for watching Morning Live. Now, the Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, said that the debt is our greatest weakness. This, of course, was said when he was tabling his emergency supplementary budget yesterday. He added that due to the coronavirus pandemic, the country's economy is expected to contract by 7.2% this year. The minister also noted that government's consolidated budget, which includes debt service costs, for the first time will exceed 2 trillion rand, and that South Africa will miss its tax target by 300 billion rand in 2020. And joining us now to discuss this matter further, we're joined by Kieswetter, the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service, or SARS. Mr. Kieswetter, thanks so much. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Sakina.
So, Mr. Kieswetter, just looking to some of the touch points from what the finance minister had to say yesterday. Let's start by taking a look at that 300 billion rand in revenue shortfall this year. Firstly, how much of that is attributable to the coronavirus pandemic, and what are the other drivers?
So one of the things we looked at is what was the revenue collection during this period last year, and then compare it to the comparable period for this year. And we have seen a significant contraction year on year. Let me give you a few examples, Sakina. An important measure is payroll taxes. That gives you also the strength of the job market. And we have seen this year, in the same period during the coronavirus period, we have seen an under-collection of 18.5 billion compared to the target. But also year on year, we've not seen growth. We've in fact seen an 11% contraction. That's an amount of almost 13 billion. A second area, which is a reflection of the health of the consumption economy, that's when people buy and consume goods. We see that in a number of ways. In domestic VAT, we have seen a contraction, a significant contraction of 16%. In import taxes, which is both import VAT and import duties, we've seen a contraction of 26%. And then in excise duties, specific excise contraction of 42%. Those consumption taxes, 33 billion down compared to the same period last year. And so you'll see, therefore, our total under-collection for the year, which is 54 billion, comprises of a significant, or also gives you a significant reflection of the health of the economy. What we are really concerned about is many of those jobs that are lost, some of them may never return. We also know that in this period, we have had close on to 80,000 applications for directives. That is when a company applied to us the tax clearance directive because they intend to retrench people. So almost 80,000 people is that component, a billion. So definitely we see tax as a leading indicator for what's happening in the economy, and it's not a pretty picture.
It certainly isn't, Commissioner Kieswetter. And the minister also pointing out that debt is our greatest weakness. And this, of course, has taxpayers worrying, should they be bracing themselves for increases in taxation and inflation, given that our debt levels are skyrocketing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, let's just pause there for a moment. And I know in this show there are many families watching. It is sad if one of the biggest items on your family budget is just to service your debt that you have incurred. And so if your debt begins to approach the size of our economy, which is what 81%, 82% of debt to GDP means, and it's costing you 5% just to service that debt, then you are in trouble. And so that filters down to everything, the goods and services that families must get, and particularly the poor and the most vulnerable, the social grants that are paid, the health workers that are employed, the frontline workers. All of that then begins to be constrained, the amount of money left for investment. And so every single family in South Africa should be concerned about rising debt levels. Eventually, as the minister warned, we reach a point where we can no longer service our debt. And if this was your house and your bond and you can no longer repay it, you lose your house. Someone else begins to own it. And that's the risk that we face if, as a country, the minister spoke about the straight and the narrow gate. Well, there's also a word that says there are none so blind as those who do not want to see. And if we, as a country, starting with policymakers and senior civil servants, but the rest of South Africa, don't see the writing on the wall, then the future for us will become more painful.
So, just staying with that for a moment, Commissioner Kieswetter, the Finance Minister also then outlines for us that for every rand that the taxpayer pays, 21 cents goes towards paying interest on debt that has been incurred in the past. Now, what sort of pressure does that put on SARS?
Well, the entire economic situation has placed an inordinate pressure on SARS because tax collection is merely a reflection of what happens in the economy. If your economy thrives, then tax revenue benefits from that. When the economy is contracting or struggling, when jobs are lost, when businesses are not performing and making profit, when consumers aren't consuming and buying, you see that in tax collection. And therefore, we have a projection of the around about 300 billion under collection. What we're also doing at SARS is to say, well, we also know that our compliance levels is not what it needs to be. So I also want to use this platform this morning to make an appeal to taxpayers to ensure that they remain compliant. The government has put in place a number of relief measures for businesses and individuals and for ordinary families. And this cannot be provided if taxpayers become negligent. And so we are focused on 5 areas for the coming few years, but this year, obviously, we will gain momentum. The first is just an increase in general levels of compliance. Pay the taxes that are due, make the declarations that you have to do, and do it honestly. We have seen a slippage in that regard, particularly amongst employers who then make it hard for the employees downstream to fulfill the obligation. The second area is what we call aggressive tax planning. Wealthy and complex individuals, as well as international companies with international businesses, they often abuse the tax system and erode the South African tax base. And so a huge focus on that. And then criminals thrive under conditions such as we have at the moment. Even under the sad reality of COVID, we have seen an increase in syndicated fraud attempts against our VAT system. This is to submit claims against the VAT system that are not permissible, and also under-declaring import values to defraud the system. Then, of course, the last 2 issues I want to mention is we are working hard to use technology, data, and artificial intelligence to help us not only provide an excellent service to taxpayers, but also that creates the ability for us to detect non-compliance. And lastly, there's a huge mountain of debt already owed to SARS, therefore to South African government by taxpayers. And we are redoubling our efforts to make sure that those outstanding debts are collected. And an appeal to taxpayers is, if they do run into trouble in paying their debt and not being able to fulfill those obligations, not to ignore it, but rather to come forward, to sit with us so that we can come to an arrangement whereby the debt can be settled and you can be in the clear.
And Commissioner Kieswetter, you know, as ordinary South Africans, and you hear this in ordinary conversations where people are saying, you see, SARS is so good at coming after us. But what about illicit capital outflows? What are we doing in order to try and stem the tide there? We know former President Tito Mboweni some time ago, you know, there was a report on this particular phenomenon, and it seems to continue. So are you making any sort of meaningful headway in terms of arresting that situation?
Sakina, let me first affirm and acknowledge those South Africans who express their discontent against those who perpetrate crime against the economy and therefore against the tax base. So yes, we do see the illicit economy, illegal flows out of the country, we see that making a steady trot. Collectively, as a society, SARS works with the South African police, with the SIU and the NPA to ensure that those criminals are brought to book. We are not doing nearly enough. And therefore, we are in constant conversation with the Minister and our colleagues at Treasury to ensure that SARS is adequately capacitated to build those technical skills, those investigative skills. And so what we are saying is we are making steady progress, but we are not doing nearly enough to really bring all of those who perpetrate this crime to book. And so those efforts, we will continue to build the capability. But what I can give South Africans the assurance, it is on our radar screen and it will receive continuous attention. We have now re-established the capacity to single-mindedly pursue the illicit and criminal activities, both on the tax and the customs side. And as I said, we have re-established firm relationships with the FIC, with the NPA, with the SIU. We work together to ensure that we in fact leverage our efforts to have a greater return on that effort and to have a meaningful impact. And so those South Africans who agitate against that, they should not stop, because their voices are as equally important as the efforts that we bring to bear on these criminals.
Mr. Kieswetter, does SARS have an estimate of exactly how much we are losing as a country currently due to illicit financial outflows?
Sakina, yes, we know. For example, in the tobacco and cigarette industry, we know we are losing not just illicit outflows in the total economy. We know we are losing tens of billions of rands. If you add the so-called Zama Zama gold, the underdeclaration of imports. In terms of exports, we find companies overstating the value of goods so that they can claim extra VAT, or they overstate it when they do advance payment agreements. They overstate the value of the goods that they import, and in that way, they actually get an illicit flow out of the country because when the goods come in that they declare on their customs declarations are then mismatched. And so we know that if you add this up, we think it is well over 100 billion of rand that we lose every year just from the illicit and criminal economic activities, both on the tax side as well as on the financial flow side.
Mr. Edward Kieswetter, so much more to talk about, but unfortunately out of time this morning. We'll pick this up at another time. Thank you so much for your time. Edward Kieswetter is the Commissioner of the South African Revenue Service, talking to us about the supplementary budget speech that the Finance Minister delivered yesterday. And with that, let's take a quick break before we bring you headline news.